A sleepy Lancashire town was left reeling when two of its own were found beaten beyond recognition.
This was a very serious assault. When you look at the level of bleeding, the swelling, the fact they were both unconscious, and the fact that they couldn't really differentiate the male or the female.
The severity of what happened was just shocking in the extreme.
It was a case that left a family in tatters.
She's a girl and she's lovely. Why would anybody want to attack her?
And a community living in fear.
We all just felt completely numb. Just feel powerless.
Everyone was in shock. I said they don't understand why it happened.
But would the police get to the bottom of what had happened?
It's almost like the next thing after drinking and having sex is gratuitous violence.
And ensure that whoever committed this terrible crime was brought to justice. In rural Lancashire, in the Rossendale Valley, lies the town of Bacup. It was an important mill town during the Industrial Revolution, and that proud past is still reflected in the town today.
Bacup's actually been described as the best laid out town centre in Rossendale. The house, the actual centre of the town, is superb. The buildings are stunning. You have a central hub, which is the market, and then around that you've got all the shops. Unlike a town which basically is like a clone of any other, in Bacup you've got lots of independent retailers, so you've got lots of variety.
The people of Bacup may live in somewhere proudly independent, but the townsfolk are still close-knit.
In Bacup, the one thing that you will know is everybody knows everybody, and everybody knows everybody's business. And as a local journalist, I would go into the town on a Saturday and I'd get stopped, even though I'd got my children with me, and people would be, oh, can you just wanting to tell me stories, wanting to tell me things that have happened. Everyone does know everybody.
But the closeness of this quaint town was shattered back on the 11th of August 2007, when a 999 call was made in the early hours of Saturday morning by a young girl pleading for an ambulance.
I can see the ambulance, please. I can't see where it's going.
It will do, don't worry. Calm down for me.
The police first got the call about 1:22 a.m. on the morning of the 11th of August 2007, which was the early hours of the Saturday morning, to say that they'd responded to a call that two individuals had been assaulted within Stubbylee Park, which was in Bacup, Lancashire, and that they were in a serious condition.
Stubbylee Park is just over a mile from Bacup town centre, and paramedics headed straight there to see if anyone needed help.
When the paramedics arrived at the scene, it was extremely dark. There was very limited lighting from some pathways nearby, and they had two casualties on the floor, unconscious, some making groaning noises. It would have been very difficult to apply some first aid because it was so dark.
The injuries sustained by the two victims were clearly life-threatening.
This was a very serious assault. When you look at the level of bleeding, the swelling, the fact they were both unconscious, and the fact that they couldn't really differentiate the male or the female, that demonstrated right from the outset that this was a very serious assault.
While the victims were being given medical assistance at the scene, the police tried to find clues as to who they were.
One of the priorities was to identify the victims, and the way that we initially identified the male victim was a search of his pockets, which resulted in some paperwork documentation, the name of Robert Maltby with an address. At that time, it's still problematic around identifying the female victim because there was nothing in her possession or any identity cards as such.
The male victim was identified as Robert Maltby. The police visited his home address, and his family confirmed the woman with him was likely to be his girlfriend.
Based on the description they provided, and obviously the description of one of the victims, we were satisfied at that point that the second individual was Sophie Lancaster.
20-year-old Sophie Lancaster had recently moved to Bacup to live with her boyfriend, 21-year-old Robert Maltby. She grew up 7 miles away from the town and was the youngest child of mum Sylvia.
But she was a lovely young girl, and I'm not just saying that because I'm a mum. On the one hand, she was really quite shy, quite introverted, and yet on the other hand, she could be quite bubbly and quite chatty. I think it depended what mood she was in, actually.
As she grew up, Sophie developed her own distinctive style.
When she got to 11 and 12, and she started being alternative. Mind you, she'd always been alternative, is the reality. But she chose to show that in her clothes and things. She would spend hours actually, putting the makeup on. Her nail varnish had to be right. But she was quite distinctive in the way that she looked. She very often looked quite grungy, I suppose, as well, But people did used to stop, actually, and look at her.
Sometimes she'd be wearing a bit more girly and sometimes it'd be a bit more casual and, baggy pants and, just depending on how she felt that day.
Sophie enjoyed the social scene of the alternative community, and so did her friends.
We like going to gigs. Our first ever gig was Marilyn Manson. That was an experience. She loved it. She absolutely loved it.
We'd spend most of the time just hanging out, and then as people progress more into the music or playing instruments, they'd set up little bands, and you go and watch them at the local pubs.
And Sophie chose as her partner someone who was also into the same alternative goth scene.
Sophie and Rob were a good couple. They just fit each other so well. Sophie brought the best out in Rob, and Rob brought the best out in Sophie.
Sophie and Rob were definitely soulmates. Definitely soulmates.
They were very similar, I think. They liked the same sort of things, same sort of interests. And, Rob was a very intelligent young man. And I wish Sophie could hold her own with him. I was hoping that she and Rob would be together, forever. I would hope they'd get married and have children.
The young couple were in love, had a wide circle of friends and everything to live for. So who on earth would want to beat them within an inch of their lives, and would the police ever track down who committed such a vicious assault?
The severity of what happened was just shocking in the extreme, and the description of the injuries was horrendous. I was horrified by what I heard.
August 2007, and in Bacup in Lancashire, the police were investigating a seemingly unprovoked attack that had left Sophie Lancaster and her boyfriend Robert Maltby hospitalised. The couple had been left for dead in Stubbylee Park, a local hangout popular with young people.
When the paramedics arrived, they were faced with two individuals unconscious on the floor, clearly very badly beaten, bleeding heavily, and the swelling as such was so severe that the paramedics couldn't differentiate whether they're male or female.
But Sylvia Lancaster, who lives a few miles outside Bacup, was as yet unaware of the attack on her daughter, and had got up early on Saturday morning and had gone to the shops and the gym.
Got back home, with my shopping, opened the door and picked a card up, and it's from the police, and you think, oh, that's a bit odd. Picked it up, and it said, please ring urgently. So I went to pick the phone up, and when I clicked it on, there were 14 messages. And you think, God, that's odd, I've only been out an hour.
But before Sylvia could call the police, Sophie's brother Adam rang his mum.
I said to him, why are you ringing me? What are you doing? And he went, Mum, I'm coming home. Sophie's been attacked. And I said to him, what do you mean she's been attacked? It's a little girl, how could she be attacked? And I said, is she okay? And he said, yes, she's in intensive care, she's okay. And you think, I'm not being funny, Adam, but, she's in intensive care, she's not okay.
Sylvia and Adam rushed to her bedside at the intensive care unit of Rochdale Infirmary.
So me and our Adam, you know, we both went and rushing up into the hospital room. Oh God, it was horrible. She was that swollen, you know, she had a tiny little face. I've never seen anything like it. You know, trainer marks both sides of her face. Her retainers had gone from her ears and a big chunk of her hair had been ripped out, so she's got clips in, you know, big dreadlocked hair.
They'd both been severely kicked about the head and body. We were aware that Rob had bleeding on the brain, and we were also aware that Sophie had actually had her dreadlocks yanked out, and part of her scalp was missing.
And you look at her and you think, how could anybody do that to another human being?
And Sylvia, trusting that the physical injuries would heal with time, was concerned about how Sophie might cope mentally with being so brutally attacked.
You know, the fact that Sophie had been there when Rob was attacked. And I knew, you know, how sensitive both of them were, but particularly Sophie. And I was just so upset, you know, the fact that she'd been in that situation when I knew she would never have done anything, you know. That upset me, thinking, God, what will she, you know, will she be okay? What will it do to her mental health?
But while Sophie's family hoped for an improvement in her condition, investigators were trying to establish who had committed such a brutal attack. Sophie and Rob had been assaulted in the skate park inside Stubbylee Park, and it was here that police started hunting for clues.
When the police arrived at the crime scene, the clear things that they noticed was 2 pools of blood where the victims had lain, a rucksack, and also broken bottles and some strewn cans. And from a police perspective, they would potentially be quite vital in terms of identifying individuals who'd been at the scene. During daylight hours, the sort of things that will be conducted in the crime scene will be photography, but also forensic retrievals such as cans of lager that were recovered, bottles and such, photographs of potential footprints. Certainly we had quite a lot of blood at the scene, and there was also some footprints in blood, so that was quite crucial evidence potentially to identify and link it to offenders or even witnesses.
While officers were gathering all the forensic evidence they could from the crime scene, DCI Holden and his team were investigating other avenues.
The most important thing in the early stage was to identify who'd been at the park, and then from that identify who might have been at the park when the assault took place. So the key thing for us from an investigation point of view was to identify those key witnesses, visit those key witnesses and start getting accounts off them.
Officers then carried out door-to-door inquiries in and around Bacup.
In the early stages of the investigation, we probably interviewed in the first few hours of that Saturday morning up to 12 to 15 young people. We found that they were very reluctant to speak to us or provide accounts. Part of that was probably out of fear, because if they'd witnessed this very violent assault, understandably they were frightened of the individuals involved. But also another scenario there was that actually they knew these offenders, possibly had allegiance to those offenders who might have been within their wider group. So that was a real obstacle for us to overcome.
Stubbylee Park was popular with the young people of the town, and getting them to open up about what they'd seen on the night of the attack was proving problematic.
When you're dealing with young people of that age, interviewing them is never an easy issue, and you have to follow strict protocol. So actually getting the information as to what had gone on that night must have taken the police an awful long time.
The majority of our witnesses, if not all of our key witnesses, were very young teenagers, and it was very difficult for those experienced detectives to actually find any common ground.
So DCI Holden took the unusual step of bringing in junior officers, who wouldn't normally take a central role in such an investigation, to build up trust with the young witnesses.
Officers who did understand the youth culture, music, Facebook issues, you know, all those sort of things that young people get involved in.
The young officers were leading the way with interviewing the witnesses. Meanwhile, down in Bacup, the news of the attack had spread to the local community.
People's reactions were just total shock. They couldn't believe something had happened in such a small town and such an isolated incident.
There was a degree of shock, yes, because there was never seemed to be any justification for it. That was the thing that got everybody right from the start. There was a lot of private discussions and people knew how severe it had got. And there was a lot of people quite horrified by what had gone on.
And Sophie's friends were afraid that they too might be targeted because of their unusual style.
My parents were worried that, you know, it could happen to me or my brother or any more of my friends, so I was asked to tone it down a bit, you know.
Some people were worried. I know I didn't like going out at night. If I was walking anywhere, I'd make sure someone went with me.
Back on the investigation, within 24 hours, the young police officers were making progress with the witnesses, and they'd started giving up names of possible attackers.
It was clear that there were 5 key individuals involved in the assault, certainly on Robert Maltby, and probably involved in the subsequent assault on Sophie Lancaster. So within the early stages of the investigation, we were relatively confident that we had 5 suspects that we wanted to bring into custody and interview formally about the assaults.
And in a small town like Bacup, this information quickly became common knowledge.
I was informed very soon, very early on, that people knew exactly who had carried out this attack. It's a very small community, a very small area, and news travels fast, far faster than it ever gets printed in the press. And everybody knew exactly who was involved in it.
By the Sunday evening, I had all their names. I knew exactly where they lived. I knew that they were troublemakers. And I think I even remember saying to the police on the Monday, well, I know the names.
The police arrested 3 of the suspects at home, and 2 subsequently handed themselves into the police the following day, on Sunday the 12th of August.
Initially, when they were all interviewed at Burnley Police Station, we had predominantly denials.
But during questioning, 2 of the boys did admit to being in the park that night, encountering the couple and hitting Robert Maltby once.
But none of them admitted the assault against Sophie Lancaster, and none of them would admit any involvement in a group attack on Robert Maltby or Sophie Lancaster.
DCI Holden quickly discovered that 2 of the group, 16-year-old Ryan Herbert and 15-year-old Brendan Harris, had a history of violence.
The 5 that we had in custody ranged from ages of 15 to 17 years of age. Whilst it was hard to imagine people of that age being involved in such a violent assault, what we knew certainly about Herbert and Harris is that they'd been involved in a very similar incident whereby they'd kicked and punched somebody to the ground. Fortunately, on that occasion, it was very minor injuries. So my initial assessment was that it was feasible that either the whole group or at least 2 of the group could be responsible for this attack.
While the boys were in custody, police went to their homes to seize the clothing they were wearing that Friday night.
It was obvious at the outset that Ryan Herbert's clothing, particularly his jeans, had splashes of blood or what we thought might be potentially blood. The rest of the clothing from the other suspects was very problematic, and it's very difficult sometimes to assess what might be blood to the naked eye, and that's where the scientific examination comes in to say either way.
The police would have to wait for the outcome of forensic tests on the clothing and trainers. But in the meantime, while the boys were still in custody, there was a further lead in the case. Investigators looked into Sophie and Rob's movements on the night of the attack and identified a garage the couple called in at on their way to Stubbylee Park.
When we investigated the garage as a location, the 24-hour garage, what became apparent is that in the early hours, some males had been seen near to the hosepipe at the garage, washing what the witness thought was either blood or mud from their faces and their hands. That became a major line of inquiry for us because clearly that could have been linked to the attack.
Could the garage provide the crucial evidence needed to charge the boys in custody? And would the police uncover the truth about the brutal attack on Rob and Sophie? Lancashire police were investigating a brutal assault on a young couple, which left them fighting for their lives in hospital. Officers were making progress on the case and had now arrested 5 local youths. With the boys in custody, investigators continued to look into every possible lead and had identified a garage that might hold valuable CCTV evidence.
When me and the investigation team first learnt that a male had been at the garage washing blood from his hands and face within an hour of the reported assault within Stubbylee Park, we were all convinced that must be connected, and we're very enthusiastic around the potential lines of inquiry around that.
But police found out there was no CCTV footage as the system wasn't working. However, officers continued to pursue this lead, hoping to confirm that the man seen washing blood off his hands was one of the 5 suspects in custody.
As a result of inquiries, it became apparent that that individual was actually involved in a separate issue and had been assaulted by something completely different. This was corroborated by several other witnesses as well, so unfortunately it was a real letdown to learn that whilst we did have someone at a garage washing blood from the hands and face, it was completely unconnected to our investigation, which was a real disappointment.
The suspect at the garage had proved to be a red herring, but DCI Holden was still confident that the 5 boys in custody were responsible for the attack on Sophie and Rob.
From the initial investigation, the initial interviews and the interviews with the key witnesses, certainly the interviews with the suspects as well, I was relatively satisfied that we had our 5 offenders. The consistent picture was that 5 males had been involved in attacking Robert Maltby. The issue for me was to make sure that we had sufficient evidence to prove that, but also the issue for me was that we had limited information around the assault on Sophie Lancaster, who obviously was equally seriously assaulted.
However, thanks to their decision to use younger officers to interview the witnesses, one of them now confirmed that they'd seen the group attack the couple. Police charged all 5 boys with grievous bodily harm with intent for the assault against Robert Maltby.
On the Sunday after the attack, that would have been the 12th of August, all 5 were then charged with the assault against Robert Maltby. At that stage, they weren't charged with the assault against Sophie Lancaster because we had insufficient evidence at that time, but we were relatively satisfied that because it followed on straight after the assault of Robert Maltby, we were looking at all those 5, or at least a few of those individuals within that group, as being responsible.
As they had no previous history of violence, 3 of the suspects were released on bail. Ryan Herbert and Brendan Harris were remanded in custody at a Young Offenders Institute. Meanwhile, the victims of the assault were still critically ill in hospital.
After that first week, it was hoped that both Sophie and Rob would recover. However, it soon became quite evident that although Rob was showing signs of improvement, Sophie was obviously in a much worse condition.
It became very obvious that Sophie was brain damaged. You know, if people could see the damage that they do, I'm sure they'd think twice.
When I went to see Sophie, she was swollen. The extent of her injuries were a big shock. If you didn't know Sophie that well, you wouldn't have recognised her as Sophie. I don't know how anybody could do that to anybody.
Sophie's boyfriend Rob had now come out of a coma, but her prognosis was poor. DCI Holden tried a new technique to gather more evidence of the extent of her injuries.
One tactic that I chose to employ was to utilise a forensic pathologist to visit Sophie Lancaster while she was in hospital. This is somewhat unusual because obviously pathologists predominantly deal with deceased persons, but what is the case is that medical practitioners at hospitals can give expert advice on what the injuries are, whereas a pathologist can actually give expert advice on how those injuries might have been caused. And what I wanted to do was make sure that at an early stage, before some of those injuries began to heal, that an expert like a pathologist could give me an expert opinion on how they thought those injuries had been sustained.
The pathologist concluded that Sophie's head injuries were caused by being kicked by more than one assailant. This theory was backed up by another witness who said that they saw the boys attack her.
By that time, we had achieved enough evidence to justify a charge for the assault on Sophie Lancaster through witness evidence and some initial forensic evidence as well. So the decision was made to bring them all back into custody, and subsequently they were all charged on that date with the wounding of Sophie Lancaster.
But Sophie continued to deteriorate, and on the 21st of August, 10 days after the attack, she was sent for a scan to determine brain function.
We heard the news that they'd done a brain test on Sophie and that there wasn't any activity, and then you know it's serious.
Sylvia rang me to tell me, well, she spoke to my mum to tell us that it wasn't good news, and they were trying different things, they were trying to bring her back round, and it wasn't working, and about taking her off to life support.
The family then faced the worst possible scenario, having to switch off Sophie's life support and say goodbye.
They pull the curtains round, and it was the first time, you know. It's even the first time that you can hold them, because they've got so many things on, you can't even hold them. So they take the machines off, and I'd done her hair, you know. I waxed all her hair the night before, because that's the only thing you can touch. And I laid down with her and she died.
It was a devastating blow for family and friends, and this tragic turn of events also had a huge impact on the investigation.
When Sophie passed away and we learned that she had died, the big change for us is that it was no longer just an assault investigation, it was a murder investigation. And there was some real enthusiasm for me and the investigation team to make sure that we brought the right people to justice who'd been responsible for murdering a 20-year-old girl in a park in Bacup.
The police proceeded to interview all 5 boys again, this time on suspicion of murder.
When we interviewed the 5 now for the murder, post the death of Sophie Lancaster, it was a completely different scenario for those 5 individuals. The dynamics of the group changed because clearly those individuals who might not have physically assaulted Sophie Lancaster then became very keen to tell us exactly who had done what. Bearing in mind that it's a difference from an assault charge to a potential murder charge, it was clear then that you know, those individuals who thought they could provide details of who killed Sophie wanted to do so and distance themselves from the murder. The account that we got from Brendan Harris was that the assault on Sophie Lancaster was completely down to Ryan Herbert, and Ryan Herbert provided no comment interview throughout the process.
The boys' admissions were supported by the results of the forensic investigation.
Primarily, Ryan Herbert was the one with the most forensic evidence on his clothing, and what he had was Sophie Lancaster's blood and Robert Maltby's blood splashed up the inside of his trousers, and also quite well embedded into the tread of his trainers. And what the forensic scientists were saying is that the only way that could occur is if he was stamping in pools of blood, or what is probably more likely the case is stamping on the victim who is bleeding profusely. So that was really compelling evidence.
Ryan was now the prime suspect for Sophie's murder, and while in custody at Lancaster Young Offenders Institute, police monitored his phone calls.
He subsequently rang his mother and had a conversation with his mother about the death, during the course of which he made an admission to his involvement to the attack on Sophie Lancaster, which was obviously very compelling evidence. As a result, we had to make a formal application to the prison service to allow us to use that as evidence in the potential trial. The gist of the conversation between Ryan Herbert and his mother was that his mother was saying to him that even though Sophie Lancaster had died, he'd nothing to worry about if he wasn't involved, to which he responded, "Well, I was."
Ryan Herbert was articulating what investigators thought all along, that he was central to the attack on Sophie and Robert. And as if that wasn't enough, police had another tactic up their sleeve. They bugged the police van Ryan Herbert and Brendan Harris were travelling in from the Young Offenders Institute.
The results of the listening device was that there was a discussion, unsurprisingly, about the incident and specifically about the murder, and Ryan Herbert made reference to kicking Sophie Lancaster like a football. When we heard that particular comment, that was completely consistent with everything that we were presented with forensically and from the pathologist, which is severe kicking around the head. And one of the key witnesses describes the victims being booted, really booted, and that's the actual terminology.
Although Ryan was clearly central to the attack, the police believed that all 5 suspects were involved, so equally responsible for what happened.
My assessment was that these 5 had acted together, but not necessarily all had been involved in the physical assault on Sophie. Despite that, if you can present a case that there's a joint enterprise, you don't actually have to prove everybody was involved physically with the assault.
On the 6th of September 2007, less than 4 weeks after the attack, all 5 boys were charged with the murder of Sophie Lancaster.
I hated him right from the beginning, right from word go. And the fact that it was a murder trial would be murder. And I just thought, thank God for that, because actually they'll get what they deserve. You know, yeah, justice was probably at the top of my mind at that stage in the game.
By early November, Rob had recovered enough to leave hospital, but the physical and emotional scars of the attack remained. He was well enough, however, to join Sophie's family to say goodbye to her.
The funeral was absolutely amazing. There weren't a single person missing. All of her friends were there. All of her family were there. People from the alternative community were there. And some of her bestest of friends said things about her and read bits.
Everyone brought a single flower to lay on her grave. We had a white coffin and we got to write a message on her coffin. And it was a hard day, it was a long day.
The atmosphere at the funeral was very positive, very sad, but it's about celebration at the end of the day, you know, a young girl, and she deserved to have her life celebrated. It was really quite uplifting.
Sophie may have been laid to rest, but justice had not yet been served. The case was set for trial in March 2008. Would the witness testimony and forensic evidence be enough to secure a murder conviction against the suspects? Police investigating the murder of Sophie Lancaster in August 2007 had charged 5 local boys with her murder. And the viciousness of what had happened to Sophie and her boyfriend had altered the mood of the quaint Lancashire town of Bacup.
People were absolutely appalled at what had happened and disgusted. They were angry, they were annoyed, and they felt that they'd taken something away from their town. They'd made their town a hated place, and that was wrong.
But prior to the trial, the legal team of Ryan Herbert, one of those accused, tried to have the charge of murder reduced to manslaughter on the basis that he had diminished responsibility on the grounds that he was autistic.
We got a very renowned national and international expert on autism who actually came to Lancashire prior to the trial and did her own assessment of him. And her assessment was that he wasn't autistic, and consequently that defence was withdrawn.
The trial began on the 10th of March 2008 at Preston Crown Court.
No, it's horrible going into that court. It was horrible. You know, you're in a small courtroom with their families. And it's really scary. It's scary, you know, and all you want is justice done. You want justice for Sophie.
All 5 defendants pleaded guilty to the charge of grievous bodily harm with intent against Robert Maltby and were facing the charge of murder of Sophie Lancaster. But on the first day of argument, the prosecution and all in the court were in for a shock.
Herbert admitted that he had killed Sophie, and suddenly everything changed.
The police and the CPS then took the tough decision to withdraw the murder charge against 3 of the boys.
Herbert's admission and plea diluted the evidence against them, and what their defence team were arguing is that this is 2 separate incidents. Their clients were involved in the first incident, but they weren't involved in the second incident. What we were trying to say is it's all one incident that they all were involved in as a joint enterprise. When Herbert admitted his part in the murder, it diluted that scenario really.
So that left the prosecution needing to prove the charge of murder against their other prime suspect, Brendan Harris. And they set out their case of what had happened to Sophie and Rob that fateful night.
What we know now from the night of the attack is that Sophie and Rob had been at a friend's house on the outskirts of Bacup, drinking, not heavily, but they'd had some drink. They left at about 11:40 p.m. on Friday, the 10th of August 2007, and we're probably going to do the walk, which would probably be a couple of miles to their home address at Bacup Town Centre. We now know that they took a slight diversion to go to the all-night garage, which is on Market Street, where I think they bought some more cigarettes. And that's where they first encountered a group of predominantly young girls who were very intrigued by their appearance, because they both had a lot of piercings and obviously dressed like goths or moshers. They built up a bit of a rapport with that group, got into conversation, agreed to join that group at a second location known as the Fudge Factory on Park Road, which is literally yards from the entrance of Stubbylee Park. We do know that there was more socialising there with that group before they then agreed to move on into the skate park within Stubbylee Park. Whilst they was in Stubbylee Park, we know now that our group of 5 offenders were already there, 2 of which had already been drinking heavily and involved in some sex with some young girls in that park. The other 3 had been at other locations. They came together as a group. While Sophie and Rob were getting on very well, predominantly with the girls, our group made reference to Robert Maltby and comments like, "Let's batter him."
For some reason, someone said hit him. Someone said, let's hit him, and they started on Rob.
Come on, let's batter him.
Consequently, Brendan Harris was the first one to step forward and punch Robert Maltby in the face, which followed by all 5 then kicking him, bringing him to the ground, punching him, certainly kicking him about the head, by which time, such was the violence of the attack, that the majority of individuals at the park had fled.
Sophie went to cradle Rob when he was knocked to the ground and she was actually cradling him. That's when they set upon her.
And then know that Brendan Harris and Ryan Herbert then went on to attack Sophie Lancaster. Brendan Harris said in his interview that Ryan Herbert actually volley-kicked Sophie Lancaster to the back of the head, having already made comments to the effect of, "She's a witness, we need to kill her."
But Brendan Harris denied that he'd attacked Sophie.
His defence centred around the fact that it was Ryan Herbert who had been involved solely in the attack on Sophie Lancaster, based on the fact that Ryan Herbert had pleaded, but also based on the fact that there was no forensic evidence directly linking Brendan Harris to Sophie Lancaster, which was true.
Although the police had no forensic evidence against him, they did have witness testimony.
The key things put before the jury for the trial of Brendan Harris were primarily the witness evidence, the evidence from the pathologist who viewed Sophie Lancaster while she was still in hospital, which gave compelling evidence of at least 2 offenders involved, but also Brendan Harris himself gave evidence, and he wasn't particularly convincing in his account, and ultimately it's for a jury to decide on what's put in front of them. Primarily, though, it was the witness evidence who basically said that they saw him kicking Sophie Lancaster.
And the jury believed the prosecution's version of events. On the 27th of March 2008, Brendan Harris was found guilty of Sophie's murder, a crime which Ryan Herbert had already admitted. But what was never addressed during the trial was why the boys had attacked Sophie and Rob. Sylvia has a theory.
The reason for the attack is because they were alternative. That's the reason. Because they chose to be who they were.
Personally, I think that they were jealous because Sophie and Rob were interesting. Sophie and Rob were different.
The only reason we ever got targeted was because of the way that we looked, or the way that we dressed, or the music that we listened to. And Sophie and Rob were never the kind of person that would have done anything to offend anybody else.
The individuals involved, particularly Herbert and Harris, had been drinking that night. They'd been involved in sex that night, and the behaviour was almost like feral. It's almost like the next thing after drinking and having sex is gratuitous violence. Certainly they've been involved in similar acts of violence previously as well. And I think when you look at Sophie and Rob's profile, they were there at the wrong place at the wrong time, looked differently. The ones that stood out from the crowd, probably 2 individuals who weren't ordinarily members of that group, but because of the way they looked, they were probably straight away identified as, individuals who could be picked on, bullied, and that ultimately was probably the motive for the attack, really.
On the 28th of March, Brendan Harris and Ryan Herbert were sentenced for the murder of Sophie Lancaster.
Brendan Harris got 18 years imprisonment. Obviously, it's life imprisonment, but with a tariff of minimum of 18 years. Ryan Herbert got the same life imprisonment, but with a minimum tariff of 16 years and 3 months.
Ryan Herbert appealed his sentence, arguing that he'd not had enough reduction for his guilty plea and had it reduced by 9 months. The 3 other defendants, who had all earlier pleaded guilty to grievous bodily harm with intent on Robert Maltby, were sentenced to between 4 and 6 years for their role in the attack.
You know, during that sentencing programme, yeah, it does make a difference, you know. At least you think, you know, they got 16, 18 years. You're good on your judge. Then you've got the other side, you know, you've got the other 3 there who only got 5.5 and 4.5, and that's not good enough.
I just don't think it's enough. To be honest, they're still going to have a life at the end of it, where Sophie's not.
Sophie's killers may have been brought to justice, but her violent murder has scarred the town of Bacup.
I personally don't think it should ever be forgotten because it was too horrific to be forgotten. Lessons have to be learned. Lessons have been learned in Bacup, I hope. And obviously that spreads out to other areas because it's not the only area where there's intolerance to some degree.
And Sophie's mum, Sylvia Lancaster, was determined that her daughter's death should not be in vain. She set up a charity in her memory to eradicate discrimination against people from alternative subcultures.
I just wanted people to understand that goths, metalers, emos, punks, whoever, metalers, you know, are just people the same as you or I. The fact that they choose, and they've a right to choose, to, you know, dress in the way that they do, listen to the music they do, live the lifestyles that they do, has actually nothing to do with anybody else. It's about celebrating difference, and that's what I always wanted to do.
One of the main aims of the charity is to leave a lasting legacy for Sophie, and the foundation just, you know, we don't go a day without mentioning her name or remembering something about her, or, you know, she's always there now, you know. She's never going to be forgotten, ever.
And the charity's work today is still inspired by the young woman who so tragically lost her life in August 2007.
I would remember Sophie. I was always very proud, you know, the fact that she stood up there and she was who she wanted to be, and she was proud of that, and she showed the world what she was and what she believed in and who she was.
I think I'll always remember her laugh. Just this giggle like she'd done bad and yet she never did, you know. And smile. Smiles and giggles.
The hardest thing over the past few years is just Sophie's not there. Trying to come to terms with why did they do it? Why did it have to turn out like it did? Why did nobody help? It's a lot of whys, really. But the hardest thing is she's not there. I still pick my phone up and go to ring her, and she's not there.